that this exposure, as I'm ramping up for my WrestleMania and everything on this national platform, is at least going to be worth some eyeballs, you know?
Well, it's just remarkable to me. And I think it adds a lot to, the story, because we're going to hear later on in the story that, when this lawsuit seemingly doesn't go away, and I think at first Vince thought, well, the heat will die down. So he sends Dr. D to Japan and they recreate this famous angle, which I think a lot of wrestling fans on Twitter last night were shocked to see. I actually knew about that though. I don't know how I knew that they recreated it, but it feels like we hear a lot of especially in that era, and obviously it's a stretch to make a comparison, but after the Brody incident, there were other promotions who wanted to run an angle about a quote unquote stabbing backstage because fans were just familiar with it. So I guess that's sort of typical promoter fare, but maybe one that a lot of folks would have assumed New Japan wouldn't have participated in, but clearly they did. But when he's sort of fading the heat, so to speak, the lawsuit doesn't go away. And eventually we see Vince ask, David, hey, go ahead and sign this document saying that it wasn't my idea and that, you're sort of holding me harmless. And that spells the end, essentially, of Dr. D and the WWF, because he doesn't want to sign it. And then he tells a fantastical story about accosting Mr. T at ringside. And of course, there's different versions of that story. And one even include the silly idea that he was hogtied with guns pointed to his head. It feels like a lot of the sort of fun of professional wrestling is it almost becomes like an old fishing tale. It just gets bigger as time goes on. What did you think of Dr. D's story of being escorted out of the arena?
Well, I mean, I think this episode is a really good example to kind of to use of like something that Jason and I kind of lean into when we do these episodes, which is I know on this show that we've referenced Errol Morris's Thin Blue Line on the show before as a major influence to us as documentary filmmakers, and there's another major influence, which is Werner Herzog, who's a famous, German filmmaker, and he made incredible films in the 70s and 80s, and then he kind of transitioned into becoming a documentary filmmaker. And he's always kind of been this proponent of, at the risk of me sounding pretentious right now, he's kind of always been a proponent of this idea of ecstatic truth, quote unquote, which is this idea of, not necessarily truth in documentary doesn't always have to mean facts, things that just are basic, because that can be very shallow in a documentary sometimes, where it's really the truth of the people that you're doing the story about, what their truth is, and how that evolves over time. And Werner Herzog always had the greatest kind of the best way to explain that in like the approach in documentary filmmaking. It's kind of where the line you draw between making a documentary and then also making a journalistic news piece, right? And his example is like in the world of literature, if facts were the most important thing in the world, then the Manhattan Phone Book would be the greatest book that's ever been written. Because John Smith, yes, he lives on 14th Street, and John Smith's phone number is this. This is all true,
right?
But in the nature of documentary filmmaking, or in this approach to documentary filmmaking, that it's like looking at, yes, John Smith does live on this street. This is his phone number. But what does John Smith have nightmares about? How fucked up was his childhood? It's kind of looking into those aspects of truth. And I think in this episode, you see that on display in a lot of different compelling ways, which is, you see kind of, heightened versions of, I think, these stories. Were there FBI agents that guarded Eddie Mansfield after the 2020 piece aired? Did David have two guns pointed to his head as he was exiting a wrestling arena with presumably fans everywhere? And was cocaine planted on like Eddie Mansfield, in that, and of course, Eddie Mansfield's line that lit up, social media last night about, comparing comparing wrestlers to the abolishment of slavery and all that stuff is like, these are the truths of these individuals in the show, and that's something that's always been something that we've always tried to highlight on the show, and like lean into, and especially because the nature of all these episodes deal with the blurred lines between reality and fiction, and that's like what wrestling, that's what's so interesting about wrestling as a sport. And so I think we always try and look at whether or not that's like a provable fact, like if he had guns pointed to his head or if FBI agents were guarding Eddie Mansfield after this. It is kind of the truth of those people at that time when the interview was taking place. And so it becomes more of a compelling portrait of them as characters. So for us, it's like, I don't know, it's a long-winded way to answer your question, but it's just something I was reflecting on last night when I was watching it back again, is kind of like, it is just a fascinating glimpse into who these people are, I think, and whether or not I think it's like that actually happened is a little bit beside the point, because I think it reveals a lot about that person. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And, I think it's interesting that wrestling, I guess, like a lot of other, areas of entertainment, there's sort of two approaches to this. We give some wrestlers a little bit of latitude and say, oh, well, never let the truth get in the way of a good story, which I think is a famous Dusty Rhodes line. Like, if you're going to tell a story, what's wrong with adding a little spice to it? So on the one hand, when Dr. D said, I got hogtied and hauled out at gunpoint, I'm thinking, you know what? I'm going to give him a pass. But then when Mansfield's talking about, people are trying to plant cocaine on me, and I had 4 FBI agents on the plane with me, and I was just doing that whole thing just to get the boys health care. That's the reason I bladed on camera, to take care of these promoters and to encourage them to take better care of us. And we needed health care and we needed a union. Fuck off. Like the Mansfield stuff just rang so hollow to me. Jason, I know you weren't there for that, but you got to see the footage. Are we on the same page here? Mansfield's full of shit.
It's like, I think, like, I don't know what his intentions were necessarily at the time. You could definitely come away with it thinking that, like, he was just like pissed off at promoters and this was like an act of revenge. But I don't know, maybe over like the course of the years since, he's like changed his like kind of perspective on it, or his perspective on wrestling. I'm not completely sure really where like his heart lies in that regard, but he does bring up like some good points. It's just, it's just hard to kind of weed through the rest of it in a way.
Yeah. Like, there are some things that he says on the episode, which I do believe, they're very relevant to today. They're conversations that we're having about wrestling right now in terms of healthcare and retirement and all that stuff. And, there are important things to talk about. And there are some important points that he's bringing up, but like to have that thought back then, I don't know. And to me, like, this is just my personal opinion, but it's almost like, I think when he went on that TV program and he did expose the business, I'm sure, I'm just speculating here, but there was a bit like a bitterness towards the industry in terms of how he was treated by promoters, as he does explain. And I just feel like for him, that the fallout of this was maybe way greater than he anticipated that it would be. And maybe there was some remorse that he had in terms of doing it. And I think maybe the only way he was able to really come to terms with it and be able to like kind of talk about it and, move on was to kind of have that narrative about it. You know what I mean? And I think maybe at his core, like, he does feel that way. I mean, he was very passionate about those issues. Like when we were doing the interview, like, that all the promos he were cutting, was essentially about that. But, it's hard to say, like, and unless we could get the actual raw footage, of that 2020 interview, which we tried to do, by the way. We tried to see if the actual raw footage, the unedited footage of that whole piece still exists, but it actually unfortunately doesn't. But we'll kind of never really know about that, and it's kind of, one of those things where we kind of leave it also up to viewers in a lot of ways, because Eddie's explaining that his mindset was that he was being pressured to show the blade, but when you look at the footage and you see him sharing that information, it doesn't really seem like he's kind of withholding it or being pressured. He kind of seems like he's volunteering it, and to me, to my eye. So I don't know. It's just I think it's just one of those things. Like, this is over 35 years ago, and it's a long time for stories and motivations to slightly evolve. So I think it's just another one of the interesting layers of telling this story, especially since it has to do with something being real or fake.
Okay. So help me out here, Evan. You say that once upon a time, Eddie was sending you messages like, oh, I got friends in Brooklyn, but then he warms up to the idea of doing the interview. But then you say later, it was on, it was off. Talk to us about working with Eddie Mansfield before the shoot, during the shoot, after the shoot.
Well, before the shoot, I mean, like I said earlier, like, there was a time where he just was he was a no-go. Like, we weren't going to be able to get him, which I was really bummed out about, because like it obviously it feels like it needs him, because he's a crucial subject of that 2020 story.
Of course. And
we wanted our story to be about the 2020 piece. And so obviously, he really seemed like he didn't want the story to be told. I mean, if he's telling me that there's goons in Brooklyn that are going to be sent after me. And I remember when we did the Jim Cornette thing, when we went to his house and we interviewed him for this episode, that was around the time when we thought that Eddie Mansfield was a no-go for the episode. And so Jim's doing his interview, and Jim, on some episodes, Jim is a subject. He's part of the story, and then in other episodes, Jim kind of is your wrestling historian voice for the episode. And this, he was perfect for. I know I'm switching gears a little bit to Jim, but I'll come back to Eddie in a second. But Jim, he kind of put this whole thing into perspective, and to show that wrestling historically, all the different exposés that have been done about wrestling over the years, have always led to, have always led to it hurting the business financially. For an example, I think there was I think it was the New York Times, back in the 30s, did a whole newspaper expose about how wrestling is fixed and all this stuff. And then it actually led to wrestling not really running in Madison Square Garden for 15 years, until the Gorgeous George era and everything like that. So there was always this direct correlation to exposing the business equals that this hurts the business financially. And so, Jim is just, such a wealth of knowledge in this whole area of wrestling history that we obviously want to include him. But it was really funny, because when he sat down to do the interview, we were basically we got to the Eddie Mansfield part of the story, and was and I think I just casually mentioned, I was unfortunately, Eddie's not going to be involved in the piece. And, he said, he's got some people in Brooklyn that are going to be coming for us, and he was like, what? And I just told him the story of he told us not to tell this story and to look the other way and all this stuff. And then Jim cut and this takes in a lot of territory here, but the most incendiary promo I've maybe heard Jim ever cut on Eddie Mansfield. And it's really entertaining, but we couldn't quite use it in the episode, because it's he's your historical voice. He's your secondary narrator. It's you can't have in your documentary Richard Attenborough or Leonardo DiCaprio, Leonardo DiCaprio basically being you motherfucker, I'm gonna bring you out into the fucking middle of the street and shoot off your goddamn kneecaps, or whatever. How dare you like, threaten these fine producers of this program, and it was amazing. It's one of the more mental, amazing Jim Cornette promos. Maybe it'll get out there somewhere someday.